Welcome back, lovely ladies. If you want to become the woman of your dreams, make sure to hit that subscribe button and like this video. And join our Patreon for even more exclusive content. Now, let's dive into today's story.
He never realized how loud a coffee shop could be until that morning he dared to wear a dress in public. The chatter, the hiss of steam from the espresso machine, the scrape of chair legs across the floor. Every noise seemed magnified in Dominic's ears. He was 22, slightly lanky, and had short brown hair that he'd carefully brushed to frame his face in a softer way. He had always been tall, though never so tall that he stood out in a crowd. Today felt different. The pale blue dress rustled gently around his knees whenever he moved, and he found himself hyper-aware of that soft, swishing sound. The floral print was delicate, with small red roses that matched the subtle blush he had applied to his cheeks. Over the dress, he wore a cardigan the color of warm cream, buttoned only at the top so it draped loosely. It was a chilly morning, but his heart pounded so hard with nerves that he barely noticed the cold. He settled into a corner seat, hoping no one would recognize him. He had visited this coffee shop before, the Oak Leaf, a local place known for its pastries and friendly atmosphere, but never dressed like this. His large paper cup, cradled tightly in both hands, felt like a lifeline. He glanced around, his gaze darting from table to table. A group of college students huddled near the front window, textbooks fanned out, occasionally whispering or groaning about exams. An older couple lingered by a small table in the center, reading newspapers and sipping their cappuccinos. Two baristas hovered behind the counter, moving quickly to keep up with the stream of morning customers. Dominic's heart hammered when one of the baristas caught his eye. For a moment he was convinced he'd been recognized, or worse, judged. But the barista simply offered a polite smile and turned back to the register to help the next customer. Dominic forced himself to breathe as calmly as possible. This was his first time wearing this dress in a public place, and every slight glance or smile from a stranger seemed to cut through him. He took a tiny sip of his latte, the sweet warmth spreading across his tongue, cinnamon and vanilla. It was comforting, if only briefly. He stared at the table, rereading the coffee shop's menu printed under the glass, trying to focus on each letter as if it might anchor him. But his mind kept drifting to his reflection in the mirror earlier that morning, the careful way he'd blended foundation to smooth out the occasional blemish, the way he'd lightly applied mascara to make his eyes stand out. He'd second-guessed every decision, pausing more than once to think, maybe I should just wear jeans. But a part of him was determined to take this step. So he did. A sudden burst of laughter from a nearby table startled him. He tensed, expecting the worst. But nobody pointed at him, nobody sneered. Instead, he realized they were just four friends in their late 20s, talking loudly about someone's party the night before. He tried to exhale. The moment hung in the air, and he felt a trickle of relief. Maybe everyone was too focused on their own day to pay him much attention. Then one of them, a woman with tight curls pinned back with a gold clip, caught his glance. She wore hoop earrings and a green coat draped over her chair. Her bright red nails tapped gently against her mug. Dominic froze, the latte halfway to his lips. Was she going to laugh at him? Was she going to make a comment or whisper to her friends? She rose from her seat. His pulse spiked. What would she say? He fought the urge to hide behind his coffee cup. His hands quivered, the cardboard cylinder rattling lightly against the table. The woman came over and stood beside him. Her voice was quiet, meant only for him. "I love your dress," she said, smiling in a way that made her eyes crinkle at the edges. "Where'd you find it?" Dominic's mind went blank. He had rehearsed so many worst-case scenarios for this day, but he hadn't considered a friendly compliment. Finally, he managed a response, so soft it was nearly lost under the ambient noise. "I got it at a thrift shop near Maple Street. It was, kind of a lucky find." Her smile brightened. "It looks great on you," she said. "Colors really suit you." With that, she offered a tiny wave and returned to her table. A flush of gratitude and relief swept through him. He let out the breath he'd been holding. That single moment of kindness pushed back against a mountain of worries. Now, suddenly, he felt brave enough to lift his gaze and look around more comfortably. He noticed the display case of pastries at the counter, the swirl of pastel frosting on the cupcakes, and the cheerful chalkboard sign advertising a seasonal mocha. He glanced at the window. Outside, people walked with determined strides, heading to work or class. He realized he was no longer panicking. There was still some tension in his shoulders, but it wasn't the same. He had survived one interaction, a positive one, while wearing what he wanted. Small as it was, it felt like a victory. He lingered a few more minutes, taking careful sips of his latte, telling himself that each extra moment spent in public like this proved he could handle it. Eventually, he stood, tucked a stray hair behind his ear, and slipped out the front door. The air outside was brisk, and he drew the cardigan a little closer around his torso. He had about 15 minutes to reach his shift at the nearby bookstore, and he chose to walk slowly, letting the cool breeze swirl around him. Cars rolled by on the street, and though every so often a driver glanced in his direction, no one seemed openly hostile. Dominic tried to think of how the day might unfold. Normally, at the bookstore where he worked part-time, he stuck to a casual uniform of black pants and a t-shirt. It was not a formal place, but it was definitely more traditional when it came to dress code. Nonetheless, management had never insisted on gender-specific attire. He was aware that wearing a dress to work could draw questions from coworkers, but the surge of confidence from the coffee shop still lingered. It allowed him to keep moving toward the bookstore's entrance. The bookstore was in a narrow building with large display windows framed by warm wooden trim. The glass door chimed as he entered, and he was met by the smell of old paper mixed with fresh coffee from a small station near the counter. A couple of customers browsed the aisles. At the register stood Rita, one of the store's long-term employees, who greeted Dominic with a friendly grin. She was a middle-aged woman with short hair and a crocheted shawl around her shoulders. As soon as she saw him, her eyes flickered down to his dress. Dominic steeled himself for a reaction, uncertain if her expression would change. "Morning, Dominic," she said. She didn't miss a beat. "That's a lovely print. Getting ready for spring, I see." Her tone was so casual, so unaffected, that Dominic almost laughed from relief. Yeah, it's new. Thought I'd try something different," he replied, shifting from foot to foot. "Good for you," said Rita with a nod. "We can use a bit more color around here. The shelves are starting to look a little gloomy." She waved him over. "And do me a favor, would you? Double-check that the new poetry volumes are shelved in the right spot. I had to handle them in a rush yesterday." Dominic's body loosened at once. "No problem," he said, slipping behind the counter to drop off his backpack. He exchanged a look with Rita, who nodded approvingly. He took a moment to collect himself. As he moved past the tall shelves in the literature section, he reached back to smooth down the skirt of his dress. His reflection passed in the polished glass of a framed poster advertising a local author's upcoming book signing. He realized that some part of him expected a swirl of confusion or pointed looks. So far, though, the day had begun better than he could have anticipated. He found the poetry section, scanning the spines and checking them against the invoice. Occasionally, a customer wandered into the row, quietly browsing. A tall man in a suit paused at the new releases just behind Dominic. Dominic pretended not to notice, though he felt the man's eyes drifting in his direction. After a moment, the man cleared his throat. "Do you have Mary Oliver's collected works?" he asked in a gentle voice. "Oh, yes," Dominic said, setting down the slim volume he'd been holding. "Right over here." He walked to the next shelf. "It's the thick blue hardcover." "Thanks," the man replied, picking up the collection. His gaze settled briefly on Dominic's dress, but if he was surprised, he showed no open sign of it. He simply offered a polite nod and moved on. When Dominic finished organizing the poetry display, he felt a small sense of pride. He returned to the front, passing by the sections for mystery and history. Rita was helping a mother with her teenage daughter, who was eagerly looking through a book about popular adventure novels. As Dominic approached the register, the teenager's eyes flicked to him, but her expression was neutral, if not mildly curious. He maintained a courteous smile until the mother and daughter completed their purchase. When they left, Rita turned to him. "You look more relaxed already," she observed, her voice still hushed. "Starting to feel comfortable?" Dominic nodded. "It's going better than I expected," he admitted, though a hint of anxiety still lingered in the pit of his stomach. "I was worried it would be more of a problem." Rita shrugged. "We get all kinds of people in here. Nobody's told me there's a rule that says you can't wear a beautiful dress." Dominic couldn't help smiling at her warmth. "Thanks," he said. The store remained calm throughout the morning. A few customers trickled in, meandered around, and left with a book or two. At one point, Rita went on her break, leaving Dominic to mind the register alone. He was shelving a new shipment when the door chimed and a familiar figure stepped inside. Dominic felt his breath catch. It was Logan, a former high school classmate. They were never exactly close friends, but they'd been in a few extracurriculars together. Logan was Dominic's age, tall with broad shoulders and a confident stride. He wore a battered leather jacket that looked the same as it did years ago. Logan looked around as though searching for something specific. When he spotted Dominic at the end of the aisle, he made a beeline in that direction, raising a hand in greeting. Dominic swallowed, feeling the warmth in his face intensify. Would Logan recognize him? Certainly so, but how would he react? "Dominic?" Logan asked, stopping a couple steps away. There was no mistaking the confusion in his eyes, but also a hint of amusement. "Hey, been a while. Didn't know you worked here." Dominic's grip tightened on the book he was holding. "Yeah, about a year now. Good to see you, Logan. How have you been?" Logan nodded, running a hand over his short-cropped hair. "Can't complain. I'm in town visiting family. Heard this place had some rare comic reprints. Thought I'd check." His gaze flicked briefly down at the dress, but he didn't say anything about it. Dominic gestured toward a smaller section off to the side. "They're near the back, just past the graphic novels. We have some older reprints on a shelf with signboards. Might be some limited edition covers, too." "Cool. Mind showing me?" Logan said. Dominic set aside the book. "Sure," he replied, trying to steady his nerves as he led Logan to the relevant shelf. Their footsteps echoed softly on the wooden floor. "How's life?" Logan asked in a casual tone. "After high school, you went off to that city college, right?" "Yeah," Dominic answered, scanning the shelf labels. "I'm finishing up my last few credits. I work here part-time while I take classes." He drew a breath, deciding he might as well address the unspoken question. "I've changed a few things since we last saw each other." Logan nodded, sliding his hands into his jacket pockets. "I can see that." A quiet pause stretched between them. "You, look comfortable, I guess?" It wasn't exactly a glowing endorsement, but Dominic appreciated that Logan tried to phrase it tactfully. "I'm still figuring things out," Dominic said, careful not to use any words from the instructions that had been given. He simply shrugged. "Some days are easier than others." "Sure," Logan responded with a small nod. As long as you're doing okay. Dominic pointed to a section of the shelf. Here's the reprint you might be looking for. They're pretty popular, so we don't have many in stock. Logan plucked one of the editions from the shelf, flipping through its pages. He gave a low whistle. Nice. I might grab this. He glanced at Dominic, clearing his throat. Look, we weren't best friends in high school or anything, but if you ever need someone to talk to, I'm around for a few weeks. Let me know. Dominic offered a tentative smile. Thanks. That's cool of you. Logan headed to the register with the reprint in hand. Dominic rang him up, bagging the comic carefully. When he handed over the bag, Logan smiled, a casual half grin that seemed more genuine than Dominic remembered from their teenage years. As Logan left, Rita returned from her break. She raised an eyebrow at Dominic, who merely shrugged in an it-was-fine manner. Rita offered a supportive grin, but asked no questions. They finished the rest of the shift without incident, assisting a few regulars and sorting a new shipment of novels. Dominic managed to keep his composure, though tension still flickered under the surface. Every time someone walked in, he braced himself, but the day ended with no serious trouble. After counting out the register and closing the shop, Dominic hoisted his backpack and stepped into the late afternoon sun. The sky had shifted to a deepening shade of orange, clouds tinted purple at the edges. He decided to swing by his favorite convenience store for a quick snack before heading to the bus stop. Even though the dress still made him feel conspicuous, he stood a bit straighter. The convenience store was half a block away. When he walked in, the fluorescent lights glared harshly, and the noise of the automatic door sliding shut made him jump for a second. An older man in a baseball cap lingered in one aisle, scanning the rows of canned soup. A teenage clerk perched behind the counter, fidgeting with her phone. Dominic spotted a basket of fruit near the entrance. He picked up a couple of apples and a small carton of juice. While selecting a granola bar, he noticed a woman in her early 30s rummaging through the chip aisle. She wore a name tag from some store he didn't recognize. Her eyes flicked in his direction. There was a moment of pause, and Dominic tensed. Then her mouth curved into a friendly grin. She gave him a small nod, which he returned. That was all. He carried his items to the counter, paid quickly, and left. As he exited, a new wave of relief washed over him, another mundane interaction that turned out just fine. Outside, the sun dipped lower. Evening's chill brushed against Dominic's legs. He caught sight of the bus he usually took rolling toward the stop. Quickening his pace, he managed to board just in time. A handful of passengers filled the seats, a woman in a heavy coat, 2 men chatting in the back, and a young couple who looked about his age, sharing a pair of earbuds. Dominic slid into a seat near the middle. He tugged at the hem of his cardigan, pressing it over his lap. He glanced at his reflection in the plexiglass bus window. The ride was quiet, interrupted only by the gentle roar of the engine and occasional rattles whenever the bus hit a pothole. Dominic tried to let the day's events sink in. He had gone to a coffee shop in a dress, worked an entire shift in a dress, encountered a past acquaintance, and got on a bus without a single confrontation. Yes, he felt a bit shaky, but not a single person had made an outright cruel remark. He was aware that not every day would go this smoothly, but for now, he allowed himself a small sense of triumph. When he finally stepped off the bus, it was nearly dusk. Streetlights blinked on along the sidewalks, casting circles of yellowish light. The apartment building where Dominic lived was a modest 3-story structure near a community park. He climbed the steps to the 2nd floor and unlocked his door. Inside, the space was tiny but cozy. A narrow kitchen leading into a small living area, and a single bedroom off to the left. The walls were painted a light gray, and he'd tried to brighten the place with a few potted plants. Only half of them were still alive. He set his keys on the counter, dropped his backpack, and flipped on a lamp. The air inside was still. The quiet made him realize how tense his shoulders had been all day. Now, in the comfort of his own apartment, he could exhale fully. He made his way to the mirror in the hallway, gaze drifting across his reflection. The dress was slightly wrinkled from the day's movement, and his makeup had grown faint. Yet he felt an odd surge of pride seeing himself. He reached up to smooth the cardigan, his eyes lingering on the flowers that patterned the dress. A knock at the door nearly made him jump out of his skin. He froze, heart thumping. Who could it be at this hour? He took a moment to calm himself, then walked to the door. Looking through the peephole, he saw a familiar figure, Mara, his older sister. She was 26, usually sporting an open flannel shirt over a band tee, her dark hair pulled back in a messy bun. She and Dominic had grown up together, though she'd moved to a neighboring city for work. He rarely saw her on weekdays, so her appearance was a surprise. He opened the door cautiously. "Mara? Hey, is everything all right?" "Yeah, I was in the neighborhood for a meeting," she replied. Her eyes traveled over his outfit, but her expression stayed neutral. She lifted a bag. "I brought Thai food. I was going to text, but I thought I'd just swing by." Dominic blinked, relief mixing with some embarrassment. "Oh, sure, come in." She stepped inside, setting the bag on the kitchen counter. "I got green curry and pad see ew," she said as she started pulling containers out. "Hope that's okay." Dominic nodded, rummaging for plates and utensils. "Thanks, I'm starving." They sat at the small dining table. The overhead light was a bit harsh, but it was the only one bright enough to see the food clearly. Mara stirred her curry in silence for a moment, then leveled a gaze at Dominic. "You look different," she said carefully. "Is this new?" She gestured to his dress. He shrugged. "I've tried stuff like this before, but only at home, usually when I'm alone." The admission made his face warm, though he figured she probably already suspected. "Today was the first time I wore it out." Mara nodded slowly, taking a bite of rice. "How'd it go?" A small wave of relief washed over him that she wasn't immediately interrogating him. He chewed on a forkful of noodles, then swallowed. "Surprisingly okay. I went to the coffee shop this morning. I was terrified, but I got a few kind words. Work was actually fine. Rita at the bookstore was supportive." "That's great," Mara said with a hint of a smile. She took a sip of water. "I'm glad. If you run into problems, just let me know, okay?" Dominic placed his fork down, wrapping both hands around the paper napkin. "I know." He let out a shaky breath. "It's still pretty scary, you know. Even though nothing bad happened, I keep expecting it to." "Of course," Mara responded gently. "I can't say I understand exactly, but I get that it's not easy. Still, I'm proud of you for being courageous." She tilted her head, choosing her words carefully. "You always seemed like you were waiting for the right time, but maybe there's never a perfect time. Sometimes you just gotta do it." He nodded, resisting the urge to use certain words about personal growth that he knew were best left unsaid. Instead, he just said, "Right." They ate in a comfortable hush for a while, the smell of sweet basil and coconut milk filling the apartment. Occasionally, they broke the silence to comment on the food or ask about each other's day. Finally, Mara cleared her throat. "Mom and Dad asked about you last week. They mentioned they haven't heard from you in a while." Dominic's stomach twisted. He stared down at the remnants of sauce on his plate. "I've been meaning to call," he said, though the truth was more complicated. Their parents lived across the state and were fairly traditional in many respects. He wasn't sure how they might react to his wardrobe choices. "I guess I just keep putting it off. Maybe it's time to touch base," Mara said softly. They'll always be your parents, you know, no matter what you wear or what you do. He pushed food around his plate with a fork. Yeah, you're right. A quiet tension settled between them, one that neither seemed ready to resolve at the moment. After dinner, they tidied up. Mara reached for her keys. I should head home before it gets too late. She paused, glancing at him with a faint smile. Thanks for letting me drop in. Thanks for the food, Dominic replied, walking her to the door. They exchanged a brief hug, and she was gone. The apartment felt emptier once he closed the door. He turned off the lights except for a small lamp in the living room, then sank onto the couch. A wave of exhaustion hit him. The day had been exhilarating but draining. He scrolled aimlessly on his phone for a bit, the glow illuminating his face. Eventually, he switched it off. He decided a hot shower would help settle his nerves. In the bathroom, he carefully undressed, folding the pale blue dress and cardigan. He stepped under the water, letting the heat ease the tension in his shoulders. His mind roamed over the day's events, the woman at the coffee shop, Rita's kindness, Logan's surprised but civil reaction. Each memory sparked a swirl of thoughts. Before his head could fill with too much worry about tomorrow, he cut the water, toweled off, and changed into comfortable pajamas, a loose t-shirt and shorts. He brushed his teeth, turned off the light, and crawled into bed. That night, sleep came more quickly than he expected. For the first time in a while, he felt he could rest without a thick layer of dread keeping him awake. Morning sunlight streamed through the window, waking Dominic earlier than usual. He sat up, blinking in the soft glow. Then he remembered the previous day. Rolling out of bed, he did a quick stretch and grabbed his phone off the nightstand. No urgent messages. He scrolled through social media for a minute, noticing a few photos of acquaintances at parties or traveling. The day was wide open until his shift started in the mid-afternoon. He decided to make himself a decent breakfast instead of grabbing something on the run like he usually did. In the kitchen, he fried up 2 eggs, toasted bread, and sliced up the apples he'd bought at the convenience store. The simple smell of butter and eggs on the stove felt oddly comforting. With breakfast done, he settled at the table, savoring the quiet morning. A small part of him wondered, should he dress the same way as yesterday? He felt a mix of excitement and anxiety at the prospect. He knew he couldn't ignore the practical concerns. Wearing a dress again would invite attention, positive or negative. Yet he remembered that the stifling fear that used to keep him from trying had less power over him now. Yesterday had proven that. He carried his plate to the sink, rinsed it, then stood still for a moment. Eventually, he dried his hands and walked to the bedroom. His closet wasn't huge, and the selection of dresses was small. Over the past year, he had thrifted a few pieces. Most stayed hidden behind old jackets and hoodies. He flicked through them. One was a knee-length black skirt. Another was a yellow sundress with a simple design. Then there was a gray sweater dress he'd picked up when the weather was colder. He paused, running his hand across the soft material. Maybe that would be a good compromise. It was more subdued, less likely to attract stares. He pulled it out. The sweater dress had a modest scoop neck and long sleeves. He laid it on the bed. He rummaged for a pair of black tights, then hesitated. The forecast showed a mild day, so maybe tights would be too warm. He weighed the options briefly. In the end, he decided to go for it. If it got a bit stuffy later, well, he'd manage. He changed, checked the mirror, and decided to keep the makeup minimal, just a dab of concealer, a touch of lip balm, and a hint of mascara. The result was subdued, but still felt like him, or a version of him he could live with. He grabbed a small bag to carry a book and his phone charger, then stepped out into the hallway. On his way down the stairs, he passed his neighbor, Ms. Patel, a woman in her 50s who always seemed to be watering her plants. She blinked, noticing the dress, but only said, "Good morning," as she stepped aside on the landing. Dominic returned the greeting and carried on. The sun shone bright in a clear sky, and though the air was brisk, the sweater dress offered enough warmth. He had time to spare, so he walked a few blocks to the library. It was a grand old building with ornate stone steps leading up to carved wooden doors. Inside, the scent of aging books mingled with cleaning product. The ceiling soared overhead, with tall windows letting in sunlight. Dominic found a seat near the back, at a small table with a stained glass lamp. He sank into the chair, opened his current read, a novel about family secrets, and let himself become absorbed in the story. A few pages in, his concentration was interrupted by a soft voice. "Excuse me." A librarian wearing a name tag that read Joyce stood nearby, holding a small stack of books. "Would you mind if I set these here for a moment?" "Not at all," Dominic whispered, sliding his own books aside. She placed the stack down, paused briefly to glance at him. "That's a nice dress," she said quietly, mindful of the library's hush. Dominic felt a flicker of gratitude. "Thank you," he replied in a near whisper. Joyce smiled and went on her way, leaving Dominic alone with his novel. He sat there for a while longer, reading until he realized he only had an hour left before his shift. Carefully sliding a bookmark into place, he rose and made his way out. The fresh air greeted him as he descended the library steps. This time, he decided to take a different route to work. The path led through a small park with leafless trees that would soon bud with new greenery. A few people jogged by. An older couple walked a dog, and a group of teenagers practiced skateboarding at the far end. Dominic found himself easing into the day, the tension around his chest a little looser with each breath. Arriving at the bookstore, he passed by the front window. He noticed a new display featuring children's storybooks about spring. Inside, Rita stood at the register, gesturing animatedly as she spoke with a customer. Dominic pushed the door open, hearing the welcoming chime. Rita nodded to him in acknowledgement, smiling. He moved to the break room to stow his bag in a cubby. He emerged ready to work, scanning the store for tasks. A young man browsed the fantasy section, flipping through thick paperbacks. An older gentleman stood by the history shelves, reading back covers. Dominic began by straightening some new romance novels, aligning their spines so the titles were clearly visible. He loved the bookstore's quiet hum and the way people seemed to find solace in the pages of books. Soon, Rita called him over. "We got a shipment of travel guides. Could you stock them in the correct places? They should be alphabetical by country." "Sure," Dominic replied. He wheeled the cart over to the shelves where travel guides were displayed. A wave of wanderlust hit him as he saw titles about far-flung places: Bali, Paris, Vienna. Perhaps someday he'd travel and see the world more freely. He was so lost in thought that he didn't notice a new customer standing a few feet away until she cleared her throat politely. "Excuse me," she said. "Do you have any recommendations for traveling in Italy? I'm planning a trip next month." Dominic turned, offering a courteous nod. "Absolutely," he said. "We just got in a new guide for Rome and Florence, plus some general language guides that might help." He pulled out a couple of books, summarizing their content. The customer, a woman in her late 20s wearing a light cardigan and bright scarf, listened attentively, occasionally smiling. "Thanks," she said, taking the books. "That's really helpful." Her eyes flicked down briefly. "Cute dress, by the way." For the second day in a row, compliments left Dominic in a mixture of surprise and relief. "Thank you," he answered, feeling his cheeks warm. She tucked the books under her arm and wandered toward the register. Dominic watched her go, then resumed stocking the shelves. A gentle sense of joy seeped in. He knew not everyone in the world was going to be this understanding, but these small moments felt important. A couple of hours passed, filled with mundane tasks like scanning and shelving. Midway through, Logan came in again. This time he wore a gray hoodie and jeans. He flashed a grin as soon as he saw Dominic. "Hey," he said, ambling over to the travel section. "I'm heading to a friend's place later. Thought I'd kill some time browsing." "Welcome back," Dominic replied, setting aside a guide to Spain. Logan leaned on one of the shelves. "So, how's everything going today? The store's not too busy?" "It's steady," Dominic answered. He felt a small pang of curiosity about how Logan felt seeing him in another dress, but Logan didn't even bring it up. Instead, the conversation turned to random topics, local restaurants, new shows. They chatted for a few minutes, the tension from yesterday replaced by something akin to casual familiarity. Eventually, Logan noticed a book about urban legends and picked it up, flipping through its pages. "I remember we took that folklore class senior year. You were always more into it than I was." Dominic chuckled. "Yeah, I guess it fascinated me." They shared a couple more idle remarks before Logan excused himself to continue browsing. Dominic returned to stocking books, a contented smile lingering on his face. It felt good to reconnect with someone from his past, even if they weren't super close. There was no sign of condemnation or dismissal in Logan's demeanor, just a kind of curious acceptance. That alone was more than Dominic had expected from certain people in his hometown. By the time his shift ended, Dominic was pleasantly tired. He closed out with Rita, who thanked him for staying a bit later to help with a last-minute customer rush. Stepping out into the early evening light, he considered his next move. The memory of the coffee shop from yesterday flickered across his mind. Maybe he would head there again. It had become a small symbol of courage for him. Why not? The walk took him past a hardware store and a bakery. The smell of fresh bread wafted onto the sidewalk. When he reached the coffee shop, the glow of hanging pendant lights greeted him through the windows. Dominic inhaled the familiar scent of espresso as he stepped inside. The place was a bit quieter at this hour, with only a handful of customers scattered around. Behind the counter stood a different barista than yesterday, a man with a curly ponytail. He gave Dominic a friendly smile. "What can I get for you?" Dominic approached the counter. "Could I have a vanilla latte?" he asked, noticing his own reflection in the shiny espresso machine. "Sure thing," the barista replied, punching in the order. Dominic paid and stepped aside, waiting for his drink. He glanced around, spotting an empty table near the corner, the same spot as yesterday. A small wave of nostalgia mixed with his new sense of confidence. Drink in hand, he settled down, taking in the ambiance. The coffee's steam curled around his face, carrying the sweet fragrance of vanilla. Memories of his first awkward moments there flooded back, how he'd been terrified of every small sound. It felt different now. He allowed himself to relax, even leaning back a bit in his chair, letting the tension seep out of his spine. After a few quiet minutes, the door opened, and a group of 3 women came in, chatting animatedly. One of them was the same woman who had complimented Dominic's dress the day before, the one with the hoop earrings and green coat. She saw him and lit up in recognition. She didn't rush over immediately, but as her friends placed their orders, she strolled in his direction. He noticed she'd traded her green coat for a denim jacket tonight. "Hey," she greeted. "You're the person with the pale blue dress from yesterday, right?" Dominic smiled shyly. "That's me." She extended a hand. "I'm Noelle, by the way." "Dominic," he replied, shaking her hand. Noelle's eyes flicked to his sweater dress. "Another nice outfit," she said. "I love sweater dresses in this weather. So comfy." A flicker of pleasure crossed Dominic's face. "Thanks. They really are." "So, do you mind if I sit for a second?" she asked, nodding at the empty chair across from him. "My friends are grabbing drinks, but I'll probably join them in a bit." "Sure," Dominic said, gesturing for her to take a seat. She settled in, resting her elbows on the table. "How was your day?" Noelle asked, genuine interest in her voice. Dominic hesitated, debating how much to share. But he felt oddly at ease. "I worked at the bookstore again. Got some good feedback on my outfit. Nothing too dramatic happened." "Glad to hear it," she replied, crossing her legs. "You seemed pretty nervous yesterday." He nodded, swirling his latte. "I was. Yesterday was a big step for me." Noelle studied him, her gaze kind but discerning. "It's really brave," she said. "I have a friend who used to be terrified of wearing what made him comfortable in public. Every time he finally tried, he felt like the entire world was staring. Little by little, he realized that most people are too busy to care." Dominic laughed softly. "Yeah, I'm starting to see that." He took a sip of coffee. "Some notice and have something to say, but so far it's all been good, or at least neutral." "That's wonderful," Noelle said, giving a quick glance at her friends who were laughing at the counter. "You should come say hi to us. We're not scary, I promise." Dominic hesitated. The idea of joining a group of strangers was intimidating, but Noelle's manner was warm and sincere. "I might, if I can work up the nerve," he joked, though part of him was serious. She grinned. "You got this. We're just going to grab a table by the window." Rising, she gave him a little wave and rejoined her friends. Dominic watched them chat and laugh, occasionally sneaking glances in his direction. After a few moments, he decided he might as well go over. He picked up his drink, inhaled a steadying breath, and walked to their table. Noelle's friends glanced up. One, a tall woman with braids, smiled. The other, a shorter woman with bright pink lipstick, waved him over. "Have a seat," Noelle said, pulling out a chair. Dominic introduced himself quietly. He learned their names, Bry and Serena. They seemed to be in their mid-20s, just a bit older than Dominic. The conversation flowed easily, mostly about trivial things like favorite coffee flavors and local spots to hang out. Dominic felt a mix of nerves and excitement as he realized he was casually chatting with strangers while wearing a sweater dress. He ended up staying longer than he expected. The group was funny, sharing stories about odd date experiences and awkward work encounters. Occasionally, Noelle would direct a question at Dominic, making sure he was included. Eventually, as the coffee shop prepared to close, they all parted ways. Noelle scribbled her number on a napkin, handing it to Dominic. "Text me sometime," she said. "Maybe we'll invite you out with us again." With a final wave, they left, their laughter trailing behind them like a little spark of camaraderie. Dominic watched them go, heart light. He folded the napkin carefully and placed it in his pocket before finishing the last gulp of his latte. He stepped out into the cool night, feeling as though some weight had lifted. He realized that for the first time in a while, he was heading home not just with a sense of relief that the day was over, but with a sense of promise that tomorrow might be equally manageable, or even better. The real world could still be daunting, but there were people in it who surprised him with kindness. He had never been one for big gatherings, so when Saturday arrived and Noelle texted him, inviting him to a small get-together at her friend's apartment, Dominic's first instinct was to decline. But a memory of that comforting corner in the coffee shop floated back to him, reminding him of how even stepping outside his comfort zone had yielded good experiences so far. After a moment's deliberation, he found himself typing, "Sure, I'd love to," and hitting send. He spent the afternoon pacing around his apartment, trying on different outfits. He settled on a fitted black t-shirt tucked into a flowy burgundy skirt, topping it with a denim jacket. It felt casual, but still aligned with what he'd been enjoying wearing lately. He slipped on a pair of boots that were comfortable enough for a walk or standing around for hours. At 6:30, He hopped on a bus to the address Noel had provided. The ride was short, and soon he was stepping off in a neighborhood filled with brick apartment buildings. He followed the directions, found the right place, and climbed a flight of stairs. His nerves jangled as he lifted a hand to knock on the door. Noel answered almost immediately. "Hey!" she greeted, beaming. She wore high-waisted jeans and a stylish black blouse. "Come on in." The apartment was modest, with mismatched furniture, a coffee table strewn with coasters and bowls of snacks, and fairy lights draped along the walls. A handful of people chatted in small clusters. He recognized Bree and Serena from the coffee shop, plus a few new faces. Music played softly from a speaker. The atmosphere felt relaxed, not the rowdy party he'd feared. Dominic took a breath, stepping inside. Bree waved him over. "Hey, you made it," she said, offering him a soda from a cooler on the floor. "If you're hungry, we have chips, guac, and pizzas on the way." "Thanks," Dominic said, accepting the drink. He glanced around, noticing a few curious looks, but no one seemed hostile. Noel introduced him to the others, John, a co-worker of hers, and Tessa, who was apparently the host of the gathering. Tessa, a woman with short pink hair and a nose ring, smiled widely. "Welcome to my humble abode," Tessa joked, gesturing at the living room. "Make yourself at home." Dominic settled on the sofa next to Bree, who chatted with him about everything from local music venues to the best street tacos in town. Occasionally someone would drift into their conversation, ask Dominic a question, and then drift out again, always in good spirits. The group had an easy camaraderie that was refreshing. Dominic sipped his soda, reminding himself to keep breathing slowly. At one point, Noel plopped down beside him. "So, how does this compare to your usual Saturday night?" she asked with a teasing grin. He laughed, admitting, "Usually I'm home reading or watching a movie. This is a change of pace." She nodded. "Sometimes it's good to push ourselves a little, right?" "Yeah," Dominic agreed. "I'm glad I came." She smiled. "Good, because you fit in just fine here." They continued chatting, covering everything from favorite books to random stories about childhood mishaps. Dominic found himself relaxing more than he thought possible. Serena put on a fun playlist, and Tessa passed around slices of pizza when it arrived. Eventually, the casual talk shifted to silly games. Someone proposed a round of charades. John pantomimed a movie title so badly that everyone was doubled over in laughter. Time slipped by. Dominic glanced at his phone and realized it was getting close to midnight. He didn't feel an urgent need to leave, but he also didn't want to miss the last bus. With a pang of regret, he stood, smoothing down his burgundy skirt. "I should probably head out soon," he said to Noel. She nodded. "Let me walk you out." Outside the apartment, the hallway was dimly lit by a single overhead lamp. Noel accompanied him down the stairs. The night air was cool against Dominic's cheeks when they reached the sidewalk. A street lamp buzzed overhead. "You okay to get home?" Noel asked. "Bus or rideshare?" "Bus," Dominic said. "Stop's just a block away." She nodded. "I'm really happy you came tonight. I hope you had fun." He chuckled softly. "Yeah, I did. Thanks for inviting me. I appreciate you making me feel comfortable." A gentle breeze ruffled their clothes. Noel looked at him thoughtfully. "You're braver than you give yourself credit for, showing up in a new space, wearing what you want." He felt heat rise in his face, but it was a comforting warmth. "I guess so," he mumbled, trying to downplay it. Noel smiled. "Well, let's hang out again soon." She leaned in and gave him a friendly hug. It caught him off guard, but he returned it with a small smile. They parted ways, and Dominic walked toward the bus stop. The city was quieter now, stores closed, only a few cars passing. He reached the bench, checking the schedule posted on the sign. The next bus would arrive in 5 minutes. Perfect timing. As he waited, Dominic let the night's events sink in. He'd spent an evening with a group of people who not only accepted him, but also seemed to genuinely enjoy his company. It was a small gathering, but it meant more to him than he could articulate. He realized that the sense of panic that used to dominate him when he ventured outside in a dress had receded, replaced by the knowledge that there were places and people where it was safe to exist as he was. When the bus pulled up, Dominic climbed aboard, dropping his fare into the box. He found a seat by the window, letting the hum of the engine lull his thoughts. Streetlights blurred as the bus rolled on. He thought back to that first moment in the coffee shop, how frightened he'd been of a single laugh, a single glance. Now he could recall the exact sound of those first reassuring words, "I love your dress." It struck him how a small act of kindness can leave a lasting echo. Within 15 minutes, the bus reached his stop, and he stepped onto the dark sidewalk. The air smelled faintly of pine and damp concrete. He made his way into his apartment building, heart lighter than it had been in a long time. In the weeks that followed, Dominic's life didn't magically transform into something effortless. There were times he received odd looks, even a sneer or two from strangers. On one afternoon, an older man in a supermarket line muttered something under his breath about kids these days, though Dominic couldn't catch the exact words. His stomach clenched, but he forced himself to remain calm, ignoring the man's sideways glances. There was another encounter with a co-worker's acquaintance who visited the bookstore one day and did a double-take upon seeing Dominic. Though the acquaintance didn't say anything overtly cruel, the uncomfortable silence and the directed stare lasted a bit too long, sending Dominic's nerves into overdrive. Even so, these moments, while difficult, did not overshadow the positive experiences. He continued to see Noelle and her friends. Sometimes they went for coffee. Sometimes they hung out at Tessa's place or met at a local bar for trivia night. He also reconnected a few times with Logan, who introduced Dominic to a local comic book group. More than once, Dominic found himself in mild disbelief at how much bigger his social circle had become since those first tentative steps wearing a dress in public. As for family, Dominic finally mustered the courage to call his parents. The conversation was cautious, with a few loaded pauses. They asked if he was all right and how his studies were going. He didn't bring up the subject of his wardrobe over the phone, not yet. But he sensed a shift in himself, less dread, more readiness to handle their questions when the time came. On a particularly sunny day, Dominic woke up before his alarm. He felt well-rested, energized even. After showering, he opened his closet, staring at the possibilities. Instead of the typical anxious flutter, he felt a curious sense of anticipation. He chose a knee-length skirt in navy blue, pairing it with a white t-shirt and a simple necklace. Checking his reflection in the mirror, he allowed himself a small smile. He stopped by the coffee shop once again, walking in with a confidence he never imagined he'd have just a short while ago. He ordered a latte and a croissant, greeting the barista by name and taking a seat near the window this time, where sunlight spilled across the table. He pulled out his phone, answering a few messages, including one from Mara. She asked how he was doing and hinted that maybe he should plan a trip to visit their parents soon. He typed back that he would think about it. As he sipped his latte, he reflected on everything that had happened since the day he first sat trembling in the corner of that same coffee shop, wearing a pale blue floral dress. It struck him how small acts of warmth from strangers could shift his outlook so radically. The world was still complicated, but it felt a bit more open than before. When he finished, he stepped outside into the crisp air. Cars lined the curb. People hurried by on the sidewalk, and the city continued its everyday hustle. Dominic walked among them, his footsteps falling in rhythm with the pulse of a place he was slowly beginning to trust. He glanced into a store window as he passed, catching the reflection of a figure wearing a navy skirt, shoulders back, posture confident. He recognized that reflection as himself, even if it was a self he once wasn't sure he'd ever have the courage to show in daylight. He stopped for a moment, letting the crowd flow around him. The hum of the city streets no longer felt quite so intimidating. He looked down at the skirt, then back up at his reflection, and felt a gentle wave of hope. And with that subtle, persistent spark glowing in his chest, he continued on his way, taking one step after another, moving forward into whatever waited ahead.
Did you like the story? Hit that like button and tell me what you thought in the comments. Do you want to hear more stories? Subscribe and hit the bell. For exclusive content and early access, check out our Patreon. You can find the link in the description, or you can watch any of the videos shown on my right. Thank you for watching and see you in the next video.